3 extremely scary truck driver stories. Story 1. The Sign of Death. Claudio gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes fixed on the stretch of asphalt that seemed to extend into infinity. The early morning was cold, and a heavy sky filled with dark clouds loomed over the deserted road. In 20 years of driving, he had never felt anything like this, a discomfort that seemed to scratch the depths of his soul. He was used to silence, but this was not the usual quiet of a long night. It was deeper, almost suffocating. Claudio was not a man who believed in superstitions, but something in the atmosphere of that night seemed to urge him to look over his shoulder. The road was an alternative route, an old and rarely used path that promised to cut a few kilometers and save fuel. The plan was to avoid tolls and stop as little as possible to make it in time to see his son's game on Sunday. He repeated to himself that the uncomfortable feeling was just accumulated fatigue from intense days behind the wheel, something a hot coffee would fix. The road seemed to stretch in an endless line ahead of him. No other headlights in the rearview mirror, no signs of gas stations or restaurants by the roadside. Just him, the engine rumbling, and a thick darkness that accompanied him like a silent shadow. Claudio was about to convince himself that he was just tired when something in the distance caught his attention. He squinted, seeing a small object by the roadside, almost indistinguishable in the dim light. As he got closer, he realized it was a wooden cross, old and partially buried in the ground, with a name engraved in faded letters. Below the name was a barely visible date, marked in faded ink. He drove past it without slowing down, thinking it was a tribute placed by someone after a fatal accident. A common sight on forgotten roads, he thought, as he tried to convince himself that nothing was amiss. However, less than 10 minutes later, a second cross appeared. This one seemed even older, the name almost illegible. But the date. He could read it clearly, 15 years before that day. A chill ran down his spine, and a knot of discomfort formed in his stomach. Forgotten roads attracted accidents. He knew that, but seeing 2 crosses in such a short time made him feel that this was the kind of path that not even ghosts would use. He tried to laugh at himself, to diminish the discomfort creeping in. But the solitude of the road seemed to increase with every kilometer. A few kilometers ahead, Claudio began to feel the air growing denser. The initial discomfort transformed into a pulsating restlessness, hard to ignore. He adjusted himself in the seat, taking a deep breath, and accelerated a bit more, determined to overcome the fatigue and superstitions. It was then that he spotted a third cross. It stood out from the others, closer to the road and well lit by the headlights of the truck. Claudio fixed his gaze on it as he passed, feeling his heart nearly stop when he read what was written. Claudio Meneses, followed by a date, marked for 3 days later. He slammed on the brakes, causing the truck to stop with a jolt. His rapid breathing reverberated in the cabin as he tried to comprehend what he had just seen. He looked in the rearview mirror, but the cross was now far away, a small dot on the dark horizon. He rubbed his eyes, thinking that fatigue was playing tricks on him, that his exhausted brain had created an illusion. "I need to sleep more, that's all," he murmured to himself, trying to calm his racing heart. But even as he resumed his journey, the discomfort remained, like an overwhelming weight on his chest. The tension increased with every meter of the road, making Claudio feel as if he were being dragged into an abyss. The air inside the cabin felt heavier, and he had the impression that something invisible was pressing him out of his own mind. It was then that he spotted yet another cross. It was a few meters from the road and seemed to glow under the headlights, highlighting the name of an old road colleague. Claudio accelerated, hoping it was just a coincidence. But not long after, another cross appeared, this time with the name of an old friend. He began to notice a pattern. Each cross seemed to represent someone he knew. The road, which had seemed long before, now felt endless. The crosses multiplied, each one with a name, a story, a memory. Claudio started to sweat cold when he realized that one of the crosses bore his wife's name, and another had his son's name, followed by a future date. "This can't be real," he murmured, his voice weak, hardly believing his own eyes. The words trembled in his throat, and fear took hold of every fiber of his being. Something horrible was about to happen, and he seemed to be on the root of all those names and dark destinies. Desperate, Claudio felt he needed to confront whatever that dark presence was that seemed to be pursuing him. He stopped the truck, turned off the engine, and stepped out onto the cold, damp asphalt. Everything was so quiet that he could hear his own breathing, fast and irregular. The road ahead was shrouded in thick fog, almost tangible. Around him, the darkness seemed more alive, pulsating. It was then that he saw a dark figure standing next to a cross, further ahead. Claudio squinted, trying to see better, but a cold sensation ran down his spine. The figure appeared wrapped in shadows, an indistinct entity, emanating a dark and imposing presence. The figure began to whisper something inaudible, words that seemed to dissolve in the air. With a growing shiver, Claudio managed to understand only one phrase. "It has already been decided." Those words resonated in his mind, echoing like a verdict. Claudio then realized that whatever it was, he was facing the inevitable fate that haunted that road. Panic seized Claudio. He ran back to the truck, his hands trembling as he started the engine and accelerated, determined to escape that nightmare. As he drove on, the fog seemed to close in around him, turning the road into a narrow corridor where the truck's lights merely scratched the dense darkness. But Claudio didn't stop. He pressed down hard, believing that if he could just go far enough, he would find an exit. As he progressed, he saw his own reflection in the rearview mirror and barely recognized himself. His face was pale, his eyes wide, breathing ragged, but something behind him caught his attention. In the mirror, he saw the crosses appearing one by one, lined up along the roadside, as if fate were imprinting its trail with the certainty that he would never escape. Suddenly, the fog closed in completely, and everything around him faded, plunging him into absolute silence. For a moment, Claudio thought he had broken the cycle, but soon realized he was trapped on that road, in an endless darkness. Somewhere far away, the sound of an engine echoed again, and the figure of a new truck driver approached along the lonely road, about to encounter the first cross, that with Claudio's name marked for that very night. Story 2. The Unknown Passenger. Marcos adjusted the rearview mirror and cast a farewell glance at the city receding behind him. The lights grew smaller, soon dissipating on the horizon as the road stretched ahead, lonely and dark. He was a 38-year-old truck driver with a past weighing heavily on his shoulders. The recent divorce had left him shattered, and every mile traveled was a reminder of the life he had left behind. Rain began to fall, first in small droplets, then in a deluge pounding against the truck's cabin like a tragic symphony. The fogged window reflected the image of a tired man with disheveled brown hair and blue eyes that seemed to be losing their sparkle. He adjusted the load in the passenger seat, a final reminder of what he still needed to achieve. The truck's headlights illuminated the road ahead, but the darkness of the tall trees surrounding him seemed to absorb the light, creating an oppressive atmosphere. As he drove, tumultuous thoughts flooded his mind. He tried to focus on the delivery, but the loneliness of the road and the pain of separation wrapped around him like a heavy fog. He needed to move on, but every curve seemed to pull him back to the past. The sound of the engine mixed with the rain, and the distant echo of his old life accompanied him, turning into a sad song that haunted him. And so he continued through the storm, unaware that the night still held surprises that would challenge his understanding of reality. As the raindrops trickled down the truck window, Marcos saw a figure by the roadside. The headlights briefly illuminated a drenched woman, her brown hair plastered to her pale face. He hesitated for a moment, a wave of empathy mixed with caution washing over him. The road was empty, and there was no one around. What could have been an act of kindness quickly transformed into a decision laden with uncertainty. With a sigh, he stopped the truck. The woman slowly approached, her dark eyes reflecting the light as if carrying an inexplicable pain. "Thank you for stopping," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm lost." Marcos gestured to the passenger seat. "Get in. I'll take you to a safe place." When the woman entered, he felt a mix of relief and a chill down his spine. She introduced herself as Sophia and began to talk about how she was traveling to meet a friend who lived in a nearby town. However, there was something in the way she spoke that unsettled Marcos. The way her eyes seemed to study his every move made him nervous. As he drove, a friendly conversation unfolded, but soon it turned into something stranger. Sophia mentioned details about his life that Marcos had never shared, as if she had access to his innermost thoughts. He glanced at her quickly, searching for answers in her gaze. "How do you know that?" he asked, his voice heavy with confusion. She smiled, but the expression on her face was dark and evasive, as if she were hiding a deep secret. As the road continued to unfold, Marcos felt the tension rising, as if the atmosphere around him was changing. Something was not right, and the night still held mysteries he could barely imagine. The road seemed endless, and the rain showed no signs of stopping. After a while, Marcos spotted a gas station in the distance, its lights flickering like a beacon amidst the storm. He decided it was time to refuel and stretch his legs. The truck stopped, with a gentle squeal of tires, and he stepped out into the torrential rain, while Sophia remained inside, looking strangely calm. As soon as Marcos entered the gas station, he was greeted by the smell of strong coffee and fried food. The attendant, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a tired look, looked up as he heard the door open. When his eyes met Sophia's, his expression changed instantly. He turned pale, his lips tightening into a thin line. Marcos sensed the tension in the air and went to the counter to pay for the fuel. "Is everything okay with you?" the attendant asked, avoiding looking at Sophia. The man hesitated, as if he wanted to say something, but the words seemed to fail him. "You should be careful on the road, especially at night," he murmured, as if trying to warn him. Before Marcos could respond, Sophia entered the store, wet and radiant, but with a dark expression. The attendant immediately froze, his eyes widening in shock. "You shouldn't be here," he said, almost in a whisper. "Come on, Marcos. It's time to go," Sophia interrupted, her voice soft yet insistent. The atmosphere in the gas station shifted abruptly, and Marcos felt a chill down his spine. Not understanding what was happening, he looked at the attendant, who seemed more distressed than ever. But Sophia pulled him toward the door. As they left, a feeling of foreboding washed over him. What lay between them was deeper than he had imagined, and the strange interaction at the gas station only heightened his discomfort. The road awaited him, but Marcos felt he was entering an abyss he could not escape. Back on the road, the rhythm of the truck blended with the sound of the rain, but the silence between Marcos and Sophia was heavy. She gazed out the window, her expression distant, as if lost in deep thoughts. Marcos tried to ignore the growing unease inside him, but it was impossible. He couldn't understand the connection that was forming between them. After a few minutes, Sophia broke the silence. "Do you remember the last time you were happy, Marcos?" Her soft voice seemed to penetrate his mind. He hesitated, recalling happy moments, but there was always a shadow of sadness that accompanied them. "It's hard to think about," he replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Sophia turned to him, a peculiar light shining in her eyes. "You don't have to feel guilty. We all have secrets, and sometimes they define us more than we'd like." Her statement made Marcos's heart race. How did she know that? It was as if she were reading his innermost thoughts. The road began to feel familiar, and Marcos noticed there were crosses along the way, silent reminders of lost lives. These crosses, what happened here? He asked, trying to divert the conversation away from their secrets. Sophia looked at the crosses with a dark expression. They represent those who couldn't escape, like you and me. The tension grew as he began to realize the road seemed to repeat itself, each curve bringing new crosses and memories. The feeling of being trapped in a nightmare only intensified, and Sophia's image became increasingly enigmatic. He wondered who this woman really was, who now seemed so deeply connected to his fate. The road continued to unfold, but time felt distorted, as if Marcos were in an endless loop. Each cross they passed felt more like a reminder of what was at stake, and a sense of panic began to spread through his body. He looked at Sophia, who now had an almost supernatural glow in her dark eyes. "Marcos," she began, her voice more serious than before, "you need to understand, I'm here for a reason." He held his breath, feeling that something profound and disturbing was about to be revealed. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice trembling. Sophia leaned closer, her eyes fixed on his. "I died on this road, in an accident. My car rolled over, and no one found my body. Now I'm stuck here, and you are the only person who can help me get out." The revelation hit Marcos like a bucket of cold water. Horror began to spread through his veins, and the reality of the situation struck him hard. "What do you want from me?" he whispered, his heart racing uncontrollably. "If you help me move on, I can free you from your past," she said, her words like a dark lullaby. The road ahead grew increasingly foggy, and he felt reality beginning to unravel. "But you have to follow me. You can't escape." Marcos felt the urge to fight, but a part of him was intrigued by the possibility of finally freeing himself from the pain that had haunted him. The truck began to shake, and the rain intensified, pounding fiercely against the cabin. He knew he had to make a choice: follow Sophia and uncover the truth, or fight against a fate that seemed inevitable. The atmosphere inside the truck was heavy, as if the air were charged with the electricity of a storm about to erupt. Marcos felt his heart racing as he struggled with the reality of Sophia's revelation. The road ahead seemed like a trail of nightmares, where life and death intertwined in ways he could never have imagined. "I can't follow this," he finally said, his voice firm but filled with fear. "You can't force me into this." Determination grew within him, fueled by the need to escape not only the road, but also the emotional weight that oppressed him. He accelerated, seeking escape in speed, but Sophia leaned forward, her presence becoming more oppressive. "You don't understand. There's no way out," she screamed, and a thunderclap roared outside, as if the very sky were responding to her agony. The road ahead seemed to shimmer, distorting into a mirage. He could see the crosses now, closer than ever, as if they were coming together to surround them. With renewed determination, Marcos decided he would no longer be a hostage to that journey. He slammed on the brakes and made an unexpected turn, veering off the main road. The truck swayed, and he felt fear rising, but adrenaline overcame anxiety. Rather than surrender, he would choose his own destiny. As the truck skid, Story 3, Ghost Passenger. The raindrops hit the truck's windshield like tiny hands trying to get Marcos's attention. He adjusted the steering wheel, his fingers tense as he gazed at the muddy road ahead. The night was dark, and visibility was limited. But in a way, it wasn't different from how he felt in his life. Since the accident, a shadow had hung over him, turning every trip into a reminder of the pain he couldn't erase. Marcos, 38 years old, had disheveled dark brown hair and eyes that carried the fatigue of long hours on the road. The weight of his loneliness accompanied him like an invisible passenger. The memory of his friend Lucas, who had died in a truck accident during a trip, haunted him with every mile he drove. Guilt and regret loomed like headlights, illuminating every mistake, every decision that led him to this point. He passed through small towns where neon signs flickered shyly. There wasn't much traffic on that remote road, which only heightened his sense of isolation. A disturbing thought crossed his mind. What if I'm next? The idea of disappearing like Lucas was terrifying. He shook his head, trying to dispel the visions, but the pressure of his past followed him like a persistent echo. As the rain intensified, he accelerated, seeking to escape the darkness that surrounded him. The road seemed endless, and even though the night was full of life, he felt completely alone. The truck's lights reflected in the puddles, creating distorted images that danced before him. It was an ordinary night, but for Marcos, it could very well be the prelude to something terrible. Marcos was absorbed in his thoughts when he spotted a figure by the roadside, a young woman, drenched by the rain and with a look of despair on her face, was waving frantically. He hesitated for a moment, his instinct for safety clashing with the compassion that still lingered in his weary heart. But loneliness was a burden he could no longer bear. With a resigned sigh, Marcos slowed down and stopped beside her. The woman got in, her presence like a breath of fresh air inside the dusty cabin. She was about 20 years old, with long dark hair sticking to her wet face, and green eyes reflecting a mix of gratitude and fear. "Thank you for stopping," she said, her voice almost lost in the roar of the rain. "I'm Sophia." "Marcos," he replied, trying to hide the strangeness he felt. The atmosphere in the cabin seemed to shift, as if the temperature had suddenly dropped. As he resumed driving, he noticed that the road was even darker, the trees seeming to lean in as if they were listening. Marcos tried to keep the conversation going, asking what she was doing on that deserted road. Sophia began to speak about her dreams, her life, and the loneliness that pursued her too. He felt an inexplicable connection. With every word she uttered, a part of his pain seemed to ease. But at the same time, a strange feeling settled in. Something about Sophia's presence awakened deep memories he wasn't ready to confront. The rain continued to fall heavily, creating an almost hypnotic sound that filled the cabin. Marcos drove in silence, absorbing Sophia's words. She talked about her dreams of traveling the world, meeting new people, and exploring places she had never seen. However, there was a sadness in her voice, a melancholy that contrasted with her enthusiasm. "I've always wanted to be a photographer," Sophia confessed, looking out the window at the blurred landscape, "but I ended up putting my dreams aside. Now I feel like I'm stuck in a place that doesn't belong to me." Marcos felt a pang of empathy. He too had abandoned his dreams, succumbing to the endless routine of the roads and deliveries. As she spoke, visions of his past began to emerge, fragments of moments he tried to forget. He saw Lucas's smile, his infectious laughter, and the promise that they would always be together on the road. But all of that crumbled in the blink of an eye. And now he was here, carrying a load that included not only boxes, but also the weight of guilt. Sophia, noticing his silence, turned to him. "What are you thinking?" she asked, her gaze piercing. "About how cruel life can be," he replied, his voice trembling. The cabin fell silent for a moment, and then Sophia said, "Sometimes we need to look back to understand what really happened." Marcos furrowed his brow. There was something unsettling in her words, as if she knew more about him than she should. A chill ran down his spine, and he began to feel that her presence was not just a ride on his journey, but something deeper, more disturbing. As the road unfolded before him, Marcos realized that the shadows of the past were about to reveal themselves in a terrifying way. The atmosphere in the cabin grew heavy, almost oppressive, as Sophia's words echoed in Marcos's mind. He looked at her, noticing details he had previously ignored, her pale skin, as if she hadn't seen sunlight in years, and the way her green eyes shone brightly, reflecting ancient wisdom. An uncomfortable sensation began to settle in Marcos's chest. "What do you mean by looking back?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Sophia smiled, but there was a tone of sadness in her gaze. "Sometimes, the things we don't confront stay with us, even after we think we're ready to move on. You can't run from your past, Marcos." Her words hit him like a blow. He felt his heart race as memories of the accident began to flood his mind, vivid and distressing. The image of the truck overturning, Lucas's scream, and the pain of knowing he couldn't save him. Do you know what happened?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I know your story," Sophia said softly. "You're not the only one carrying a heavy load. I carry mine, too." Suddenly, a wave of awareness washed over him. Sophia was not just a passenger. She was a connection to his past, a lost soul trapped between two worlds. He looked at her, searching for answers, but before he could ask, a bright light appeared ahead, blinding his vision. Marcos tried to swerve, but the light seemed to draw him in, and in an instant, he saw the accident reflected in that brightness. The truth about what really happened on that fateful day was about to be revealed. "Marcos, you need to face this." Sophia's voice seemed distant but clear. "You can't hide forever." The blinding light dissipated, and Marcos found himself in front of a scene that froze his heart. It was the vision of the accident, but now he was immersed in the experience. He was inside the truck, recalling the deafening crash that changed his life forever. The sounds, voices, and images mixed into a whirlwind of emotions. "No!" he shouted, gripping the steering wheel as if he could control reality. "I don't want to relive this. You need to," Sophia said, her voice now echoing amid the chaos. "To be free, you must accept what happened." Marcos saw Lucas, smiling and carefree, beside him. The moment before the accident was clear in his mind. The laughter, the light conversation, the friendship. And then, everything fell apart in an instant of despair. The memory of the anguished scream, the sound of twisting metal, and the silence that followed. "I couldn't save him," Marcos screamed, the pain overflowing from his chest. "It was my fault." "It wasn't," Sophia replied firmly. "You had no control, but carrying this guilt is killing you. It's time to let go." He looked at her, and the connection between them seemed to intensify. Sophia wasn't there just as a passenger. She was a guide, an echo of what he needed to confront. The fear of letting go mixed with the need to free himself. As he looked at the scene before him, Marcos realized he needed to face his truth, not just for Sophia, but for himself. The scene of the accident slowly unraveled, like a movie being rewound. Marcos felt his heart tighten as the fragments of his past dissipated. Looking at Sophia, he realized she also carried her own scars, and it was her pain that kept her trapped. "I can't keep going like this," he said, his voice breaking. "I need to leave this behind." Sophia smiled, a smile that carried both sadness and hope. "Yes, you can. Free yourself from the guilt and the weight you carry. Only then can we say goodbye." Marcos took a deep breath, feeling the tears burn in his eyes. He knew it was time to accept what happened, to let the guilt slip through his fingers. With one last look at the past, he closed his eyes and murmured, "I forgive you, Lucas. I'm so sorry." A wave of relief enveloped him, as if a heavy chain were being lifted from his shoulders. When he opened his eyes again, the truck cabin was bathed in a soft, warm light. Sophia began to disappear, her ethereal form shining like a spirit about to ascend. "Thank you, Marcos," she said, her voice gentle as a breeze. "Now I can finally find peace." With one last smile, Sophia faded away, and a sense of lightness filled Marcos. He felt that the road ahead was now free of shadows, and the weight of his past began to dissipate. Marcos continued his journey down the road, but now every mile felt lighter. The rain had lessened, and the clouds were starting to part, revealing a starry